For this case study, I will be talking about how to deal with Mrs. Stevens. She is irritable, hostile to suggestions, and difficult to communicate with. I will use research to attempt to justify Mrs. Stevens' poor evaluation, and at the same time use research to attempt to justify Mrs. Stevens' point of view. I will offer some suggestions for things that can be done to help Mrs. Stevens improve her teaching in order to have greater student achievement. The principal's job is to help teachers improve. Mrs. Stevens doesn't feel her evaluation is fair and will not go down without a fight. I will decide if I think Mrs. Stevens deserves to be fired or not based on research. What happened in a single sentence? Mrs. Stevens is fighting to keep her job after a poor evaluation from her school principal. The facts. The people. Mrs. Stevens, the principal, and the students. The place. It's a school. It's unknown if it is rural or suburban. The program. It is unknown if it is public or private. The school. The outcome. The outcome of this conflict could be damaging to mainly Mrs. Stevens, but I would imagine she has some students that care for her. Firing her after only 1 year can have consequences for the stakeholders, which could be both staff and students, many that care about Mrs. Stevens. Have other relevant stakeholders been consulted about getting rid of Mrs. Stevens? The answer is no. Another question to consider is it fair or even legal to fire Mrs. Stevens after only 1 year? How to conduct frequent classroom visits, walkthroughs, and observations to provide constructive, meaningful, actionable feedback that supports the development of faculty and staff. One must make walkthroughs routine. They should be only 5 to 15 minutes. Before the walkthroughs, there should be a meeting with staff to establish clear expectations. Every walkthrough should have a focus. The focus should be connected to established standards. There should be specific things to look for, such as, is the objective of the lesson clear to the students? After the walkthrough, the administrator must reflect and then provide the teacher with real-time feedback on their instruction. Things to be done during formal observations are the following. Once the teachers are used to walkthroughs and constant feedback, observations should be easier. Some things that can be done during formal observations are: number 1, prepare yourself and prepare the teacher. Be clear about what you expect to see in the classroom and make sure your ratings coincide with others in the school. Number 2, look for learning, not teaching. Instead of observing a teacher, observe the class and look for evidence of learning. Mrs. Stevens' students were not learning. That is obvious. Number 3, properly judge the lesson plan. 3 things to consider when evaluating a lesson plan are: number 1, are the students engaged? In this case, no, they weren't. Number 2, does the teacher make it clear what the students should be learning? I don't think so in this case. Number 3, is there classroom participation? Not much. Number 4, tie your observation to the professional learning at your school. This is not done for Mrs. Stevens. Number 5, give feedback promptly. Offer one positive note as you leave the room. Follow up quickly with a full report. Teachers crave timely, meaningful, and actionable feedback. Mrs. Stevens did not get this type of feedback. These are all things that should have been done for Mrs. Stevens from the start. If not, then maybe she is right in saying administration has failed her. What sources and types of data can be used to provide feedback to teachers so that they can improve student learning? Some sources to provide actionable feedback to teachers are: number 1, learning walks. Groups of 4 to 8 teachers observe their peers for 20 minutes, taking notes using an observation form tied to research-supported focus areas. Number 2, peer-to-peer. Teachers choose a learning partner within or across their grade or content area and observe for 20 to 30 minutes. Number 3, video feedback. This is watching videos of other teachers. Number 4, expert coaching. School-based coaches provide observation and feedback to the teacher. Number 5, principal walkthrough, brief observation. 5 to 10 minute walkthroughs that once the principal leaves, they write down 2 to 3 pieces of actionable feedback on a note card for the teacher. Co-planning. Co-planning is working in teams to plan specific lessons together based on incorporating key strategies tied to feedback they have received. Interview or survey students. Students are amazingly articulate about what types of instructional practices help them learn. All of these things could be done to help Mrs. Stevens to become a better teacher. Of course, any and all feedback should be actionable. Actionable feedback is a critical attribute in learning and continuous improvement. As a first-year teacher, Mrs. Stevens needs this type of feedback. What role do formal and informal assessments play in evaluating the effectiveness of a school's instruction and programs? Formal assessments are data-based tests that measure what and how well the students have learned. They determine the student's proficiency or mastery of the content. They can be used for comparisons against certain standards. Some examples of formal assessments are standardized tests, achievement tests, and aptitude tests. Informal assessments are those spontaneous forms of assessment that can easily be incorporated in the day-to-day classroom activities and that measure the student's performance and progress. They are content and performance driven. Some examples of informal assessments are checklists, observations, and portfolios. Both formal and informal assessments are needed because they complement each other. Both can be used to improve instruction and learning. A question to ask here is, what role do formal and informal assessments play in Mrs. Stevens' classroom? What types and sources of data can be used to monitor and evaluate instructional strategies? Formal and informal assessments provide significant insight into students' progress, curriculum effectiveness, and teaching strategies. Standardized tests gauge overall learning and identify knowledge gaps. This information gives teachers high-level insight into what students know. Individual assessments reveal each student's needs. Teachers can do these assessments to students entering their classes. This data gives educators a deep understanding of their students' personalities and abilities, and even insight into their learning styles. Summative assessments catch learning roadblocks and also inform curriculum and instruction. Formative assessments provide immediate feedback on lesson plans. Informal, low-stakes assessments can be used to measure learning immediately after class. This allows for quick modifications for the next class. What are some sources of teacher evaluation data other than direct classroom observation? For something as serious as a teacher like Mrs. Stevens losing her job, there must be other factors taken into consideration besides direct classroom observation. Number one, is there documentation of Mrs. Stevens engaging in any professional development activity? Is she trying to improve or not? That is an important question. Student achievement data can be used to evaluate Mrs. Stevens. Are her students doing well? I imagine the answer is no, because she has difficulty motivating them. Student and parent perception should also be taken into consideration. Is Mrs. Stevens well liked by students and parents? The answer seems pretty obvious. No, she is not. But maybe that's not true. Maybe that's just the principal's point of view. On her teacher evaluation form, Mrs. Stevens was rated as average for her relationship with both students and parents. I think maybe that might be too high of a rating coming from the principal. He seems to not see much of a relationship at all. She should probably be below average, especially if we are talking about firing her. What are the responsibilities of a principal for helping a teacher to become more effective? First thing is a focus on quality of instruction. There is a focus on the quality of Mrs. Stevens' instruction. Unfortunately, the quality of her instruction is low. The principal should define and promote high expectations. There's no evidence of Mrs. Stevens getting a definition of high expectations from the principal or the principal promoting high expectations to Mrs. Stevens. This could be seen as something that was not provided to Mrs. Stevens and a reason for her to keep her job. Encourage continual professional learning. Mrs. Stevens was not encouraged to engage in continual professional learning. This is another reason not to fire her. The principal should emphasize research-based strategies to improve teaching and learning. This was not done for Mrs. Stevens, yet another reason for her to keep her job. The principal should initiate discussions about instructional approaches. This should be done even though teachers would rather be left alone. Mrs. Stevens would rather be left alone, but that doesn't matter. If we want to be able to justifiably fire her, those difficult conversations about instructional approaches need to take place first. What teacher characteristics and behaviors, if any, are known to be associated with teacher effectiveness and should be observable to a supervisor during classroom observation? The first characteristic is assertive. Mrs. Stevens is assertive. She doesn't seem to be helpful, sincere, friendly, or sensitive to student needs, so she isn't responsive. Effective teachers are clear. They present content in ways students can understand. They are relevant. They use examples, explanations, and exercises that are relevant to students. They are competent. They are content experts, and they know how to teach. They are trustworthy. They are honest and genuine. They are caring. They care about students, understand them, and have their best interests at heart. They are humorous. They use humor frequently in class, but not too much. They disclose. They reveal an appropriate amount of personal information when it's relevant. Out of all these characteristics, Mrs. Stevens only seems to be assertive. This is not a good thing. Maybe Mrs. Stevens is in the wrong career, or maybe she needs help to improve. Maybe she can become all of these things. What, if anything, can be done by a supervisor to obtain an accurate impression of how a teacher usually acts in a classroom situation? In order to obtain an accurate impression, the principal needs to build a relationship with the teacher. It doesn't seem that there is very much of a relationship with Mrs. Stevens at all. Don't get too cocky. There is a big difference between a leader and a boss. Principals that are authentic are respected by teachers. Cocky principals are not. I'd imagine Mrs. Stevens feels she has a boss and not a leader. Get out of your office. The more time spent outside of the office interacting with teachers and students, the better. This creates an atmosphere of trust. Listen to teachers' suggestions and input. Mrs. Stevens told the principal that she was never offered any practical ideas. The principal should listen to that suggestion. What factors seem to be influencing the conclusions drawn by the principal based on his classroom observations of Mrs. Stevens? What other kinds of conclusions could be drawn? One factor that seems to influence Mrs. Stevens' evaluation is that the principal likes every new teacher but Mrs. Stevens. The focus of Mrs. Stevens' evaluation was not on the students. This was Mrs. Stevens' evaluation, not the students' evaluation, yet the main focus was students were talking, students didn't respect her, she can't control the students, she had no influence over the students. As stated earlier, this should be a focus, but not the only focus. We can conclude that there is no relationship between the principal and Mrs. Stevens. If there was a relationship, Mrs. Stevens most likely wouldn't be so irritable, hostile to suggestions, and difficult to communicate with. The evaluation focused on Mrs. Stevens' inadequacies. Was there anything that Mrs. Stevens did do well? Apparently not. So then why was she hired in the first place? Why does the school want to get rid of her after only 1 year? Why aren't they willing to help her improve by giving her real actionable feedback? Telling her to motivate and involve students more isn't very actionable. How should she go about doing those things? My final conclusion is that the principal doesn't like Mrs. Stevens and wants to get rid of her. Either that or he isn't a very good principal. Of course, I'm putting myself in the principal's shoes. Unfortunately, if Mrs. Stevens is a bad teacher, I am an equally bad principal.